Welcome to episode 12 of the Expert Cruise Show. I'm Anthony, he's Chris, and it's our job to take you to sea as we do every week, bringing some of the kind of cruise chat that you might have with your cruising partner, and when they're bored of it, just come and hang out with us. Because for me, it's the post-cruise analysis, it's the pre-cruise excitement. If you love a ship and you love a cruise, then you've come to the right place, because that's basically who we are. Last week, we had a very special episode because it was our Queen Mary episode. Now, we're not talking about Queen Mary 2 from Cunard, we're talking about the original, the 1936 Cunard ship that if you haven't seen last week's episode, I highly recommend. It was Chris's first time on the ship, and he's still. How are you feeling now? Because we've texted about this, haven't we? You say that you kind of feel the desire to go back on it, and you live about 15,000 miles away from that ship, so it's not an easy task.
No.
How do you feel?
I mean, as I think I said last week, like my desire to get back to the ship is even stronger than what it was to go there the first time. I was only on board for 24 hours or just over 24 hours. It's just not enough time to like really get to know the ship. But you get enough of a sense that you just want to go back. And you've been naughty because you've been sending flight options and saying, look, it's only 18 hours away.
That's the thing. Which is funny. Yeah. Well, Queen Mary is a floating hotel in Long Beach, California. As we said on the extensive episode last week, that she has been in Long Beach longer than she was at sea. She was a blue riband holder. She was the fastest ship across the ocean at the time. She lost that title to the SS United States. But you know, we celebrate her. Why would you say? I suppose this is a good place to start, because, by the way, this episode is like a follow-up to last week's Queen Mary episode, because there's still so much more to say. You know, what is it about Queen Mary's life cycle when she was at sea that has driven a desire for cruising now in the 21st century? Because, you know, I love to watch archive footage from Pathé News and old BBC documentaries, including the Alan Wicker stuff that we spoke about, and just look at how people enjoyed themselves on these ocean liners of old without the modern luxuries that we have, like the spa and the treatments, and obviously access to the internet and you know, just the contemporary stuff that didn't exist back then. I just love watching people on these documentaries, especially the QE2, because you know we have so much footage of people on board the QE2, which was the precursor to Queen Mary 2, really, in terms of Cunard's kind of history. People were just able to really just lose themselves at sea, especially on the transatlantic crossing. So I thought that's what we could do today, is just talk about that experience at sea and what the ship had to offer back then compared to what we enjoy now on modern cruises.
Yeah, I mean, the 1930s were an interesting time because obviously Queen Mary was being designed and developed in the late 20s, early 1930s, and then they set about, you know, building her. And the scale of the ship and the scale of ships that were being built at that time from the late 20s onwards was such a huge step up from what had been available before, that many people who travelled on the Queen Mary in those early years, pre-World War II, they could remember most likely travelling on much lesser ships where there was much less to do. And so the scale of Queen Mary, you know, 80,000 gross registered tons, over 1,000 feet in length, she's a big ship. And she allowed the introduction of so many more spaces and public rooms on board, which would have been this magical world for people who boarded this ship and saw things like
Disneyland.
Absolutely. Can you imagine, you know, if you're thinking about traveling, if you were traveling in the 1920s on, say, Mauritania, and it's a smaller ship, you know, it's over 700 feet in length, it's very narrow on the beam, it's, I think, 92 feet wide, and there's very little to really do. There's lounges and public spaces, but they don't have the activities that you had on board a ship like Queen Mary. And then you board this ship, it's got this Art Deco interior, interior. It's got a shopping promenade. It's got an observation bar. It's got beautiful open decks that are just uninterrupted. It must have been like stepping into a magical world. And I think this is where that whole getting there is half the fun idea came up, because prior to the Queen Mary's generation, ships were a means to an end. It was the only way to get to a place. You endured the journey, and if it was comfortable, even better. Whereas Queen Mary, they tried to make that ultimately 4.5-5 day crossing really, really enjoyable. And although there wasn't the cruise staff teams like we have today, there was plenty of things to do and to amuse yourself and occupy yourself on board that just hadn't been there before.
And I guess the older ships, Mauritania and Lusitania, were they shoveling coal? I mean, there was black soot coming out of the smokestacks, right? I mean, it was a smelly and not a particularly clean experience, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, they were post-World War One and interwar period, they were reconditioned to run on oil. The refueling process was much quicker that way, at least, and less dirty.
Yeah.
Although, if you look at the archival footage and you see even Queen Mary, you see all the smoke pouring out of the smokestack, you just wouldn't get away with that these days, thank goodness.
Right. I mean, it's no different, though, to looking at aeroplanes from the 80s taking off and seeing all that black soot coming out the engine.
But like, I think of someone, say someone like, you put you or myself into the mindset of somebody back then. If you look at the time that it's been since you and I went on QE2 for the first time, and then you think of modern ships today, there's been change, and it's been, you look at Oasis class and Icon class, big change, right? But the scale of change, if you took our lives and put them back in like now we're sitting in the 1930s and you think that we started cruising on the Mauritania would have been, state of the art when we were starting out. And it really is a massive change in the way that ships were designed, in the way that they were powered, the way that they were fueled, but also the scale, the absolute scaling up of their interiors. Queen Mary, and then when Queen Elizabeth entered into the foray, but also rivals like the Normandy and the Bremen and the Europa and other ships, Rex and Comte de Savoie, they had these the scale of amenity on board was so much higher than what you might have imagined just 20, 30 years before.
Well, some of those European ships, they tried to emulate the palaces of their own nations.
Absolutely.
So they wanted to be like a palace at sea. Certainly the case with the French lines. Yeah. But I get the feeling that we take a kind of modern luxury for granted now. And some of the ships, I often talk about the Edge class on this show because I think it was such a shift where, design-wise, I don't know whether it'll stand the test of time, but design-wise, it's like super contemporary and super stylish, but it's very much of the moment.
Yes.
And we spoke in last week and even the week before's episode when we were talking about, is Queen Mary 2 the greatest ship? Is that I was talking about the interiors of Queen Mary 2 and how they're kind of timeless. They're based on Art Deco, but they're kind of timeless. And I really don't feel that Queen Mary 2 will ever really age from that perspective. Whereas other ships like the Edge class and certainly the new NCL ships, the Viva and the Prima, there is this desire to contemporize them in a way that, to me, some of them can start to look too much like shopping centres or shopping malls. And that, I think, can be problematic. It needs to look and feel like a ship. And that's why visiting Queen Mary, for those people who've only been on contemporary cruise ships, is such a Titanic experience because of all of the aspects of it that are so based in maritime design. It is a ship for the ocean to sail at speed, and so everything is designed around that. The way that the corridors are designed, just the promenade deck. It's a ship first and an entertainment venue second. And I suppose that's what I'm trying to say, not quite so clearly. Whereas these lovely new cruise ships are entertainment destinations first and ships second.
Yes, so the reason why Queen Mary exists is because on the transatlantic service, which is this very contained body of water where there's big populations moving generally from Europe to America, but throughout the Queen Mary's life there was lots of tourism that meant that it kind of balanced out. And shipping lines like Cunard and the French line and, Thalia line and White Star, they'd been running fleets of ships on these services. And the bigger, faster ships were their express liners. These are the ones we really focus in on, and we talk about ocean liners and being fast and, speedy and elegant. And mostly it's the express liners we're referring to, because there's hundreds and thousands of other ocean liners that were smaller and, just plying the trade. But these big express liners, they wanted to try and offer the most efficient way to travel across this body of water. And the ultimate goal was a 2-ship weekly express service. And when Cunard and later Cunard White Star was building Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth, the brief from Sir Percy Bates actually was the minimum ship you can build to achieve this service. They were trying to design the most efficient way to transport people as a 2-ship weekly service. It just so happens that ended up being 2 of the largest ships that the world had ever seen. Queen Elizabeth, the sister ship, being the biggest ocean liner of all time until Queen Mary too. And in fact, she wasn't eclipsed in terms of size for a passenger ship until Carnival Destiny in 96. So a very big ship. But, because it was the 30s, and of course Elizabeth entered service during World War II, but because they were designed in the 30s, you have this wonderful Art Deco style which is in vogue at the time. And so the expectation on board, the expectation of the style on board, just so happens to be a very, very high standard that even though in the 1960s when the ships were finishing their career, Art Deco had sort of fallen out of favor, and you see QE2 enter service, there's nothing Art Deco about her. We see a reversal of that throughout the 1980s into the 90s, where now you really appreciate that Art Deco style. And you look at Miami and those hotels.
Well, it fell out of favor for a while, didn't it? I think in that period in the kind of 70s and 80s, that the kind of modernity was kind of really kicking in. And the idea of doing Art Deco or any of that kind of Deco period was thought of as old-fashioned. And so QE2 was using plastics in a way that you wouldn't really think that they would, be successful with. But actually people took to that quite well, didn't they? It really reflected the time. I think it was a bit of a culture shock for people. I mean, I love the ceiling on QE2 above the dance floor with the kind of, it looks like Star Wars, actually. Yeah. It's kind of like white with these strip cutouts and lights coming through and these columns, these plastic columns going up. And it's like, I mean, that really is very much of the time, the just that introduction to the 1970s.
100%. And I think the interesting thing about the Queen Mary is that whilst at the end of her career when she was being retired, they never really successfully tried to cruise her. They did send her on cruises in the 60s, but it never really worked. And it was Queen Elizabeth, the first Queen Elizabeth, they really were trying to focus in on, can we make this ship into a cruising role? So Queen Mary got the opportunity to sort of leave as an Atlantic liner and leave on a high. And so she goes to Long Beach and she sort of gets refurbished and reopened in the 70s and maintained this sort of stately ship. And you see all this change happening at Cunard and other lines where it's ultra modern. QE2 goes throughout her career. She starts off with this fiberglass and formica and chrome, and it's just very different. But as she ages, they start to introduce sort of the Queen Mary 2-esque style Art Deco features to QE2, which oddly enough were able to be blended with those trumpet columns and the honeycomb ceiling and seem to somehow work. I don't know how.
Because QE2 is a hodgepodge of design, isn't it? And I don't remember the ship as well as you do. It's your favorite ship, right? So you have so much of a relationship with it. Obviously, I've been on her, but I haven't been on her since I was a kid. And all the imagery I look at for QE2, I never really know what era I'm looking at. It's like, was that original, or is that after multiple dry docks, or is that when they introduced the balconies up top? Because the ship really is quite unrecognizable before she was sold to Dubai. She was quite unrecognizable to how she was when she first started. Everything from the smokestack to the size of that superstructure, she just changed enormously.
Yeah, and that's what's really interesting about both Queen Mary and QM2, because they kind of bookend the QE2 in the middle, is that Queen Mary was built at a time where Art Deco, and throughout the 40s and 50s, it was still appreciated. So when you bought her now, you know, the former first class main dining room, the former first class ballroom, that they've got different names now. But the rooms themselves, they look like they did in the 30s. They look like they did in the 40s. Yes. And then Queen Mary 2, you know, you think about her, with the exception of carpets and a few rooms here and there, most of the ship is still as it was designed in 2004. QE2 was built in a time, as you say, of great change, the space age, the Concorde, the QE2, people didn't want to go on an old-fashioned Art Deco liner. But because that was a very contained sort of phase in style, she had to evolve. And then she evolved in the 70s and in the 80s, and like, you know, pastels and all sorts of other things. Like, it just wasn't what you wanted on a ship in the 90s. Right. So she got given this massive refurbishment. And I'll stick a picture up now of the midships lobby. And you look at it, and you'll know it from when you boarded. But when I boarded the ship, it looked like this. Different carpets, but everything else was the same. And the trumpet column in the middle, it's original. The ceiling style, the deck head style is original. The well is original, but all of the furnishings is different. The wood finish they put in is different. The murals are new. They were put in 1994, and that's the way that they kind of reset her. That gave her that life extension into the 21st century. And if it hadn't been for that, I don't think the ship would have succeeded the way she did, and probably wouldn't have allowed Cunard to run until they could build Queen Mary 2. Because by the 90s, when people were boarding QE2, and as you say, you board into a 60s style midships lobby with purple carpets, then you go into a corridor that's wood paneled, then you go to an area that's got Art Deco, then there's a pastel
It's
room.
like a Frankenstein ship, isn't it?
Very interesting to see those different styles and how they clash. And yet you look at Queen Mary and you think for her whole career, you know, and she had a reasonable length career, she maintained her original style. It looks like QM2 is doing the same thing.
That's interesting. You're very right about that kind of bookending of design. It's almost like, you know, QE2 was an experiment, and it was like an evolving experiment, and it took a while for people to realize what works, but time moved on at the same time, didn't it? And so by the time Queen Mary 2 came about, and QE2 was still in service, you know, famously the return journey of the maiden crossing of Queen Mary 2 that I was on. I didn't do the return back to England, but I did the westbound maiden crossing 2004. But as the ships left together, which I stayed in New York for to watch them go, super exciting to see Queen Mary 2 and QE2 side by side, one literally double the size of the other. It was a very emotional kind of handing over of this ship. It didn't go out of service then, of course, because I did that tandem crossing with QE2 on the maiden crossing of the Queen Victoria. And now, of course, we have Queen Anne, which has come in to bring Cunard back up to being a 4-ship fleet. And Queen Anne this is like full circle. In my mind, Queen Anne is more like QE2 than like Queen Mary 2 or Queen Elizabeth.
Yes.
Or Queen Victoria. Would you agree with that? I mean, certainly the staircase, you know, with that mural and the choice of those deep blues and the reds and the yellows, to me, she's trying to be QE2.
Yeah, she reminds me quite a lot of QE2, the original aspects of QE2, particularly
certainly in the grand lobby area.
Yeah, because I mean QE2, when she first entered service in the double down room, which was the tourist class ballroom entertainment venue, there was like that curved staircase. QE2 had quite a lot of connections between the two passenger decks, little hidden away stairways, which Queen Anne has. And you know what's interesting is actually when I boarded QE2 for the first time in 1995, she'd just recently come out of the Project Lifestyle refit. And all of the signature spaces that we know on Cunard now, like the the Golden Lion pub and the chart room and the yacht club, they'd all been built and they stayed in their format for the remainder of her career. But the Project Lifestyle work, in which was the code name given to that big refurbishment, it actually had quite a toned down color palette, so the carpets weren't overly in your face. The decoration, the chairs were sort of a gold, but they were like a muted gold and stuff. And the ship looked very elegant. And over the period of time from that refurbishment to when Carnival acquired her, they introduced much more of the bold colours, the darker coloured carpets, the greens and the teals and the gold trim everywhere. And that's sort of similar to what Queen Anne has as well. So it's interesting, actually, how they've done that. And I guess the thing that's most interesting about the current fleet is that I think of all of them, the Queen Mary 2 is the only one that has a style that's uniquely Queen Mary 2. And Queen Victoria's sort of trying to be Victorian. Queen Elizabeth's trying to be
darker woods.
Yeah. Queen Elizabeth's trying to be Art Deco. Queen Anne's trying to be contemporary, but Queen Mary 2 is trying to be Queen Mary 2. And that's what Queen Mary original was. She was herself. She was nothing else. There was no other like her. And even when Queen Elizabeth, the first one, entered service, she had Art Deco, but it wasn't Queen Mary's Art Deco. It was even more toned down than Queen Mary's. So they had a very specific sense of place, which I think you would agree you feel when you board the ship.
Oh, 100%. I mean, I enjoy, because I've only been on Queen Victoria and Queen Elizabeth once each, both times the maiden transatlantic crossing, which, as viewers to the show now will know, is my only claim to fame with Cunard, is that I've done all 4 maiden transatlantic crossings. And so I get those ships mixed up a little bit, because they are both these kind of enhanced Vista class ships, and they are so similar, and the differences are quite subtle. But so I like to watch vlogs and remind myself of how they've changed. And of course, Elizabeth has just had a recent refit and has had, I think, the most beautiful new carpets put in. And some people were a little bit freaked out initially that they were a bit much and too much like Queen Anne. And I completely disagree. I mean, the Queen's Room with this fantastic new floral carpet and new upholstery on the chairs and the curtains and stuff, I think it just looks fantastic, and I'm so pleased that they've done that. And it actually now makes Queen Victoria look a little drab in comparison. And I'm sure they'll be kind of rolling this out across the fleet. And at the same time, maybe they could replace Queen Anne's Queen's Room carpet completely and get rid of those kind of vomitous swirls. But I get a sense that there is always a ship for you. And, before Queen Mary 2 existed, you and I were both obsessed with QE2, right? For years, we were obsessed with QE2 because it was the only ship we really had, unless you include the Sarja Ford and the Vista Ford, those kind of recent smaller liners that Cunard had and then didn't have. Didn't one of those go to Fred Olsen or something? What happened to those two?
Yeah, so actually, the interesting thing was that they weren't even built for Cunard.
Or Saga.
They went to Saga cruisers eventually. Yeah, both of them. Yeah. And they were beautiful ships in their own right, but very different. Like if you boarded them now, if they still existed, which they don't, and you say you time traveled and you found yourself in 1994 and you board the Saga Fjord or the Vista Fjord and you knew Cunard as you know it now, you'd be completely and totally thrown because it was completely Norwegian in its styling. Like the two most highly rated Cunard ships probably of all time.
Yes.
Or maybe Royal Viking Sun might have a claim to fame as well, but they weren't British at all, which is fascinating.
Well, the names kind of gave them away. I love the fact that they didn't bother from changing their Norwegian names. But my grandmother used to go on those 2 ships in addition to QE2. And so, from my earliest years, my grandmother would come back with all this memorabilia. And I have a case in storage somewhere full of, those, they used to do those ashtrays with the ship, picture of the ship in the middle. You can find them on eBay now occasionally. I have dozens and dozens of those in storage.
Wow.
And I will be leaving them all to you in my will. I have plenty, but she would bring back all this stuff and she just loved it. And my grandmother, she was a real extrovert. She was quite contradictory, but she was an extrovert. And she, just going back to what we were saying at the very beginning of this conversation about people enjoying themselves with what they had and not having outside distractions, is that she was, life and soul of the party. And she had a boyfriend who, was quite quiet, but she was she made all the noise, my grandmother. And I can imagine her in the QE2's dining, one of the dining rooms. I don't know, I can't remember which one she used to dine in, because of course it was all class related. I don't think, they didn't ever go in the equivalent of Queen's Grill.
It was probably Mauritania or Colombia, maybe.
I think it was the Mauritania restaurant she would talk about. But I can imagine her like holding court on a shared table, right? And just knocking over a glass of wine and screaming and making a whole scene and doing sing-alongs. You know, they did lots of sing-alongs because back then, you know, there was a lot of British wartime songs that became part of the repertoire, that, you know, Vera Lynn style songs that everybody knew the words to. I guess these were songs that were sung in bunkers during the Blitz, you know, and that generation, they all knew these songs, and a lot of them were old pearly King and Queen songs from East London, you know, and my grandmother was born in where was she born? Poplar, I think, or somewhere around there, you know, certainly, you know, Whitechapel, that, you know, that whole kind of part of East London. We're all Cockneys in my family. You know, I had elocution lessons, so people think I'm educated. But I really love the idea of time travel and saying, so what is it you like about travelling on the QE2? And they're like, oh, it's wonderful. We just love it's so luxurious. And I just love this kind of, you know, this kind of English, real kind of English celebration of nothing, like just doing nothing is enough because of all of the shared experiences. And if you fast forward to today, people don't even like to share tables anymore at dinner.
No. It's a totally different experience, actually. But when there was no option and you ended up on tables with people, you actually ended up making friends most of the time.
You have a much better time, Chris.
Oh, it was amazing.
You have a much better time.
And you know what? We had maybe over the whole time I've been with Cunard, there's only one bad table that comes to mind. And even that, like all these years later, Rochelle and I will both say, do you remember those people on that table? And you'll have like a laugh about it because it was so bad. And it was only a 4-day cruise, so we didn't ask to swap. But the whole thing was dysfunctional. And but now you just don't get the option to even. Well, you do have the option, but a lot of people don't take that option. And I think you missed something.
I've just booked Queen Mary 2 again, and actually this time I decided to book a late seating, the 8:15 seating, which I don't normally do. You know, normally I book the anytime dining and tend to go around 7 o'clock, 7:15. But I'm actually considering, because I did a little bit of table sharing at lunch on my last Queen Mary 2, and it's just so different. You know, it's so different to sitting on a table for two and just being in your own world. And it's just nice to pick and choose. So what I recommend is maybe doing shared dining at lunchtime and then having private dining in the evening, or just mixing it up, because you have a completely different experience of being at sea, and also it's probably closer to what people experienced in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s and 80s, because they didn't really offer tables for two back then. So they're like, if you want to come on this ship and if you want to go on a cruise, this is what cruising is. It is a shared experience with these people that you've never met before, and yet you make amazing new friends. And I'm still friends with a whole bunch of people from my maiden crossing of Queen Mary 2 in 2004.
Yeah, no, you do. You make connections at the dinner table. You know what's interesting is that when we think back to the 30s and 40s and 50s with the ocean liners, there's a tendency, and we're all guilty of it, to sort of romanticize that era. And you see these wonderful pictures of the dining rooms. And I think that's one of the things that's true about it, is the connection that people had. Because if you think about the experience that you were having elsewhere on the ship, and look, Queen Mary is the living example, but there were thousands of ships, right? They were smaller than most of today's cruise ships. They moved a lot more than most of today's cruise ships, unless you were in the top class, first class cabins. Right. You had no ensuite, you know, bathrooms down the hall, toilets down the hall.
Sharing bathrooms is a great way to meet people.
Well, I mean, imagine that's a very different marketing angle. But, you know, like non-air conditioned, all that sort of stuff. So it wasn't the same level of creature comforts, but if you look
Yes.
at those photographs and the videos of them in the dining room where everyone's there, everyone's dressed up, the atmosphere must have been like electric, and they're serving you at the table. And I'm thinking first class, but obviously the same thing happened in second cabin and in third. In tourist, it was still a communal experience, And that was one of the things that lines like Cunard and like P&O UK up until the sort of 90s and into 2000s used to still do, was these communal experiences, captain's cocktail parties, the welcome on board parties, the crossing the line ceremonies, these sorts of things where people come together, and that can actually be traced back to those old ships, and that's probably the closest we've got to what those atmospheres on those early liners was like, because everything else around it has changed so much.
And that's why I think I mentioned on a previous episode that you must find out when the gala nights are.
Yeah.
And absolutely go to them. A, because you're going to get beef Wellington and baked Alaska, and those dishes have been served since, time began. But secondly, there is that kind of shared experience of everyone being dressed up. And even if you only want to dress up once or twice on a cruise, make sure that you get into the main dining room for those gala evenings. I do actually wish Cunard would advertise what you're going to get in advance a little more clearly, because on my last 7-night voyage, it said 2 formal nights, but it didn't mention a black and white ball or normally they're quite specific, the Royal Ascot ball or any of these things, and we didn't get any of that because you got to know what to pack. And I don't know about you, but packing for a cruise is relatively easy. Packing for a Cunard voyage is a whole lot more difficult, and we have to bring an extra case when it's a Cunard trip. And I do love the idea of, I know it only really happens now in Queen's Grill, but the idea of Chateaubriand being sliced at the table, or having a crepe Suzette flambéed by the maitre d'.
Yeah.
Again, these are the things that I think of when I think about QE2 and certainly Queen Mary. I wanted to ask you about Queen Elizabeth, because she's often the forgotten sister, isn't she?
Yes.
Queen Mary gets all the glory, and yet the original Queen Elizabeth, as you said earlier, she was not as ornate as Queen Mary, and Queen Mary wasn't that ornate. So, because of the timing of the Great Depression and, the cost savings and all those things. But I always thought that Elizabeth seemed like a smaller ship because she was a 2-funnel ship and Mary was a 3-funnel ship, and a little bit like with aeroplanes and how many engines they had with the the advent of the 747, and it was like, whoa, that's a big plane, it's got 4 engines. But actually Queen Elizabeth was a larger ship than Queen Mary, despite having only 2 smokestacks.
Yeah.
So why is she more, is it because she had a sad ending and doesn't still exist? Is that the reason why people don't really reference her as much?
I think she suffered from a few things. So I want to start by saying that on paper and for when the ship was in service, she was every bit Queen Mary's equal, and I think in some respects perhaps exceeded Queen Mary. Because, I spent yesterday and the day before I spent hours editing a video about Queen Elizabeth's entry into service when she was entered into service during World War II. So I just spent hours watching images and videos of this ship, and she is absolutely stunning. Like, everything about Queen Mary, they took and they refined for Queen Elizabeth. And the reason why she only has 2 funnels instead of 3 is because Queen Mary had 24 boilers and Queen Elizabeth had 12 of the new boilers, and they didn't need as many boilers to produce the same amount of steam, so she only needed 2 ventilation stacks. But Queen Mary was being built during the Great Depression. Then there was the pausing of the building of the ship, and the skeletal structure of the ship was sort of just abandoned for months, and it was used in newsreels and photographs in newspapers as sort of a symbol of the Great Depression. And then work restarted on the ship, and Britain, particularly around Scotland, but like lots of British shipyard workers or machinists and stuff went to work on the ship, and there was this big sort of building of anticipation around her entry into service. Then she enters service, then she captures the speed record, and she has this period before World War II where she just is the only big British liner doing these things and beating the French and all sorts of other stuff. So she has this kind of story around her. And then Queen Elizabeth sort of sneaks into service during World War II and spends the first sort of 5 years of her service life doing tripping services and, hidden away and with a secret identity and painted grey, and then ultimately goes into service in the 40s and becomes the equal to Queen Mary. But she didn't have that period of peacetime storytelling that Mary got.
So people didn't get to know her in the same way. They might have thought that she was a troop carrier and only that.
Yeah, I mean, I think people who travelled knew she was known as a Lizzie, so they knew the Lizzie. Britain,
because she was named by the Queen Mother, wasn't she?
She was
Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother.
Yes. Because Queen Mary, the original Queen Mary, was named by Her Majesty Queen Mary, the Queen Consort of King George V, and Elizabeth was named by Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, Consort of King George VI. And look, after the war, because of the service these two ships had done in the United Kingdom and in the United States, particularly on the east coast of the US, the two queens were known almost universally. But Queen Mary, because she'd been there first, she was on all the biscuit tins, she was on all of the advertising, she was the Britain's ship, really.
Right.
And then, Mary leaves in this spectacular departure in 1967 and goes off to a triumphant retirement in Long Beach and longest peacetime voyage.
The majestic Queen Mary prepares to say farewell to England forever. She's off on a final round-the-horn journey, and Royal Navy helicopters in anchor formation salute her Southampton departure. Thousands cheered, waved, sang, and wept as the old luxury lady, escorted by a giant flotilla, headed for retirement.
And Elizabeth sort of finishes up service and gets moved to Florida, opens as a hotel, but it falls over within months, and then gets sold off again to become a floating university and goes to the farthest reaches of the world as far as anyone in the UK is concerned, to Hong Kong.
She went to Hong Kong, didn't she?
And was painted white and given yellow funnels with clover leaves on them, and then burst into flames and burnt out. It was an absolute tragic end. So she doesn't get that same sense of memory. But when the SS United States entered service in 1952, when she was doing her sea trials, it became obvious to Cunard that she was going to beat Mary's record. And it wasn't Mary that they looked at whether they could do a run with to compete with the SS United States, but they actually formed a task force and looked at whether or not they could retrofit Elizabeth, overhaul her engines, and could she recapture the record from SS United States. Once the United States made her record, they realized there's absolutely no chance, but it was Elizabeth they went to, not Mary.
So that's a very interesting piece of intel there. I'd never really thought about that. And of course, she went to be a floating university, and I think it was during the construction of that where they were redesigning and rebuilding her, and wasn't... The theory is that it was like an electrical contractor or a vacuum cleaner or something that was left on overnight that caught fire.
Well, Queen Elizabeth, it's a strange situation. She was renamed Seawise University. There was some talk about what caused the fire, because there was more than one ignition source. It was simultaneous fires seemed to erupt at the same time. There's always been a lot of...
Was there a theory that it was an insurance job?
There's always been a lot of questions around it. It's a pretty... You can get down some pretty deep rabbit holes when you start looking into it,
Right.
But absolutely, tragic. And she didn't just burn and flip over. She melted almost. The whole bridge structure collapsed in. So very dramatic end to that.
And she was
ship.
capsized for a while, wasn't she? I mean, she was. They left her there for quite a long time.
They did, yeah. Actually, she was used. The visuals of the ship was used as a set, like it was the secret lair in one of the James Bond films. I can't remember which one it was, but one of them was set there, and then later they broke her up. There's a little bit of metal that's still on the seabed, I think, but actually I think some of that area has been reclaimed land as well. So the ship is well and truly gone now. But that's the interesting thing, is that Cunard always said, Cunard White Star, even when Queen Mary came into service, they always said they're not in it for the race. Now, I don't think they were being 100% honest when they said that, but it links back to that brief, the minimum possible to achieve an efficient two-ship weekly transatlantic service, which was the fastest and the largest. And so they kind of stuck with that. And I guess in the 50s, if Elizabeth could have bested Mary, what would be the point when you've got this beloved ship that's a blue riband holder, nothing's challenging her, and you've got another one?
Well, they're not in competition, are they?
No.
They're owned by the same company, and ultimately they're trying to sell tickets on both ships.
Exactly.
So to have a different marketing offering, a unique selling point, one is fast, one is larger, and she's only was like 3,000 gross tons bigger than Queen Mary, right? I mean, there wasn't much in it, but I can understand how the marketing of the time thought that was the better way to sell tickets.
I'm sure there's people in the comments, or at least sitting there at home shaking their heads, because it's a very debated point, but
right.
I think that she was the one they went to in the 50s to see if they could best United States. Like, they didn't go to Mary for a reason, right? So I think she probably would have been able to do it had she been given the chance, and then maybe she would have been better known. I don't know. It's
so interesting. It is very sad that she ended up catching fire. It would have been fun to have used her as a university and to actually have been can you imagine like being somebody enrolled in that university, knowing that you're on Queen Elizabeth every day as your campus? I mean, that would have been fantastic. But that brings us back to the kind of origins of this episode, and that is that Queen Mary still exists, is still a living, breathing, floating palace, and can be enjoyed any time. She's literally open 7 days a week, 24/7.
Yeah.
And for the price of, you don't have to stay on board, but for the price of a tour and the cost of parking, you can get on board that ship and spend the entire day there. And I just feel that we are, I think I said this last week, but we're just so lucky that Queen Mary still exists, because things that are 100 years old or almost 100 years old, you really have to look after them for them to remain intact. And as we said, testament to the new management of Queen Mary that she is still there. And I really do recommend combining a visit to her with a cruise on another ship from nearby, because that really will take you on that time machine that we've been talking about, where you can, I mean, it would be great. I would love for Cunard to be operating regularly out of San Pedro, so you could actually do Queen Mary and then a Cunard ship back to back and get that experience.
Well, they're owned by Carnival. They should dock at the Spruce Goose Dome. Like, that would be amazing.
Well, apparently there's not enough depth there for Queen Mary 2 to dock at the Spruce Goose terminal, but the cruise ships with the flat bottoms can do it a little bit easier. But Queen Elizabeth is doing an Alaska season out of Seattle, which is only like a 2-hour flight north from LAX. So you could do that. You could combine those two trips and get the new and the old Cunard experience. Any final thoughts before we wrap this one up?
Yeah, well, I was just thinking as we were going through this journey that, like, you think about you and me when we started traveling and our affection for Cunard started, and it was QE2 because she was a living piece of history that was still at sea.
Yes.
I feel like now Queen Mary 2's 20 years in, so she's getting to that position, but give her another 10 years and then she's sort of basically what QE2 was when we first started, well, when I first started traveling on board. But if you go on Queen Mary, it makes everything about Cunard make sense. Like, the whole understanding of the heritage and the connection and the deep, it's more than just a cruise line. People often say to me, like, why are you so interested in that one particular line or brand? And I'm kind of like, no, it's not just a brand. It helped form nations. It helped win World War II. It helped move people around. It helped create the cruise industry. It developed floating hotels, and now we've got Queen Mary 2 continuing a tradition that started in 1840, but was so much a part of the Queen Mary story. And I feel like that was one of the things that really happened when I was on board. Is like, I already knew Cunard, but all of a sudden it was like, oh, now there's this big piece that I've known about, but I can feel it. Like you feel it coming alive.
It's the missing puzzle piece, isn't it, for you? That experience of Queen Mary. And, you know, even now, because I love watching the vlogs and seeing people enjoying Queen Mary 2 or any of the Cunard ships because of the white glove, White Star service afternoon tea and all of the traditions, the baked Alaska and all that stuff. And I just think, I wonder how many people that are doing it know that this is a tradition that has been literally going on for 185 years.
Yeah.
It's kind of magical, isn't it? That they're still, they don't have to do it. They don't have to serve tea and scones with a string quartet playing and the service as it is, but they do, and that is what's so important. And it really is that respect of history and heritage and tradition that you get on Cunard. You get it on some of the other lines as well. You know, the Holland America is very good at sticking to its traditions and things like that with its menus and things. But I just feel like the best bang for your buck to get that old experience is Cunard, even in steerage class. You know, you can still access all of that heritage with an inside cabin at the wrong end of the ship. And that journey, that history of how we got to where we are now. So we'll come back next week with another episode of the Expert Cruise Show. And until then, happy sailing.
See you next week.